Alrighty, hey guys. So today we're going to be jumping in really to our last Cold War lesson. So Coups, Cold Wars, and the CIA. Get to talk about some spooks and what they're up to in Afghanistan and also the Soviets. That all being said, with it kind of being our last Cold War lesson, it is a good chance for us to kind of again review the ongoing U.S. commitment to deny the expansion of communism, but also to talk about kind of what the role of the United States is. In terms of world affairs. So with that all in mind, again, we're going to be kind of thinking about kind of big objectives here wise, thinking about like how does the US's role in terms of the world need to operate. We'll talk about that a little bit first. But then also with Afghanistan, looking at, it as an example of one of these many proxy conflicts that occurs in the Cold War, such as like Vietnam or Korea, what have you, right? So let's get right into it. So to take on the idea of what role the United States should play, okay? Spoiler alert, the Cold War does end, okay? And now kind of. We can talk about how it's kind of still continuing in some ways with current day events and things like Ukraine. But with the ending of the Cold War happening in the early 90s, really I'd say from the 90s to the early 2000s, 2010s, the United States is really very uncontested on the world stage in terms of power. And with that in mind, okay, even though recently there's Russia and China and India and a few other countries are on the rise comparatively, there is still very much a place to talk about what the U.S.'s role should be in the world. And so to help you kind of think about what that should be or what could be, I've given you some archetypes here that you can lean on. So these are kind of like frames of thinking kind of like roles that you can kind of build your thought upon about what the United States should be doing. So I've selected 7 of them, kind of built them for you, and then you get to pick on the one that you think its role should be in world affairs, okay? Now, you're perfectly capable of reading these descriptions on your own. You can see I've got 7, police officer, janitor, miner, philanthropist, firefighter, builder, and hermit, okay? But you can vote on, based on the description, which one you think that the United States should be, okay? Now, once you vote on that, what I would like you to do, I'm going to skip ahead here to this one, is I would like you to tell me why you think this role was, why was this your choice? Give me some evidence to kind of back up why you think it should be. And then if you had to pick a second one, what do you think that would be? If you had to go for a second one, which one would you vote for and why? Okay. So let's jump into our mini lesson and talking about how the United States is going to fit into this proxy conflict that's going to happen in Afghanistan with the Soviets. Okay. So we will need to provide some background here to talk about, Afghanistan itself, because for a lot of students, it's just not the Middle East, especially that Far East, is not somewhere that the United States, a lot of students in the United States necessarily are super familiar with. You might have, right around the time that many students nowadays are born, this is when the United States really was becoming way more involved in this region. So, let's get right to it. So again, we're going to be looking at kind of the role that the U.S. should play here in foreign affairs, and then what kind of, again, outside influences are kind of happening here, not necessarily, fitting this into the colonialism discussion that we had, but in kind of a way we can, right? About once World War II is done, what is going to be the place and the route that a lot of these different nations are going to have, such as if they're Afghani or they're Pakistani or any of these different places, what's their kind of route going to become in order for them to become full-fledged independent nation states, right? That can kind of stand on their own. So there are some connections there that we can definitely make. So let's talk about Afghanistan first, okay? So Afghanistan's nickname is the graveyard of empires. And there's a whole bunch of different reasons for why this is. Alexander the Great tried to take control of it, wasn't very successful. Napoleon tried, wasn't very successful. The list goes on, right? The British try, they're not very successful. And then also here you're going to see the Soviets are not very successful. Now why is that? Part of it has to do with the fact that Afghanistan's geography is just really difficult to maintain cohesive control. It is geographically pretty diverse, okay, and you can kind of tell that looking at the topographical map over here, but especially like just the sheer mountainous and also distance of some of these cities from one another. It's going to make communications and connections and keeping everything tied together difficult, okay? Now, also, because of Afghanistan's demographic background, a lot of groups in Afghani society are tribally, but also linguistically connected with one another, and there is not necessarily uniformity by any means across the stretch of what eventually will become Afghanistan. So trying to kind of create, again, something that's cohesive and unified there is hard. With that all in mind, and that kind of as a background here, let's get into the actual events itself. So in the 1970s, okay, so again, Vietnam is raging at this point, right? There's other events in the world that are going on. The Afghani leader, okay, his name's Daoud Khan. You can see him down here to the bottom right. He's definitely not Stanley Tucci, is what I would tell you. He is going to kick off more friendly relations with Russia. We could definitely have a whole talk about Daoud Khan because he's an interesting guy. And Russia's foreign minister, you can see him there on the left in this picture, actually. So that is Nikolai Bulganin, and that's them in Kabul. Okay, so this is back in the 1950s. This photo is taken, and you can kind of see that even just the sheer fact that they're having a meeting with one another, even though Daoud doesn't totally trust the Russians, he kind of is kicking off this era in the 1970s, and even, as you can see here before, of this more kind of friendly tone with Russia. Now, why does this all matter? Why am I telling you about it? It's because this freaks out the United States. And again, the reason why is because the whole idea of containment and communism, right? The U.S. is totally dedicated to this idea of making sure that communism does not spread. Yeah. Okay. Now, fast forward a few years, about 8 years, and by the time we get to 1978, Daoud gets overthrown in a coup, and this extremely communist but also repressive government, it's called the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. It's neither democratic or a republic. It's going to take over. But again, the fact that it is a communist takeover in Afghanistan starts flashing alarm bells back in Washington, right? This is like, oh no, like clearly communism is expanding there. The Soviets are trying to make, more close ties that are happening. Again, the rise of a communist government, it's all kind of, coincidental, right? So the U.S. starts really paying attention, excuse me, to what is going on there. Now, let's talk very quickly about this Democratic People's Republic of Afghanistan. I'm just going to call them the DRA now. They are this really weird combination of being extremely repressive, but also extremely progressive. So, for example, like they will at the same time like expand literacy and healthcare and making sure that women have rights, but then they'll just like murder their enemies. And they again are communist in name, so they are in fact supported financially by the Soviet Union. Now, all this being said, the people of Afghanistan not a fan of this DRA coup that has happened and also takeover, and so all of this repression that the DRA puts down is going to cause a whole variety of factions of resistance to spring up. These factions are not unified, okay? There are many different ones, okay? But they kind of get collectively referred to as the Mujahideen, okay? Now, you can see a picture of them here at the bottom left. The Mujahideen are of particular interest to the United States. Okay, and the reason why is because the United States sees the Mujahideen as a vehicle through which they can put pressure on Russia to stop funding, this new Afghani DRA, but also maybe just get rid of the DRA entirely, right? And so what does the U.S. do? So the U.S. goes to Afghanistan's neighbor, Pakistan, which we go back here, we can see on the map. Okay, they are right here. There's a very long border with Afghanistan, okay? And they go to Pakistan, and they call up at this time the newly organized Pakistani intelligence services. Okay, now, Pakistani's intelligence services, if you don't happen to know this about the world, which, again, I wouldn't expect you to, it's called the ISI. They are very good at what they do. And they function like Pakistan's CIA, okay? But basically what the United States does is it sends money to the ISI, and then in turn, the ISA will go and fund and use the Mujahideen to help destabilize the DRA. So again, we're funding money into one country so they can go and put money into the Mujahideen. This is money, ammunition. In the background here, this is actually a picture of a Mujahideen person eating United States peanut butter. Okay, like this is a complex, convoluted way, right, of attempting this, right, for the United States. Now, what I would like you to do is just take a moment, pause, and I would like you to develop a new archetype based on the one that the role that the United States seems to be playing in Afghanistan so far. So I'd like you to create like a picture, an icon over here, and then give it a description. So I have an example from earlier. This is the police officer one that was from the slides a few months ago. But I want you to come up with an archetype. What describes, give us a role and a description that kind of helps label what the United States is up to, right? I like seeing some creativity here. All right, so once you've done that, let's talk about then what happens from there, okay? So the DRA is going to, as I said before, it's going to heavily ally itself with the Soviet Union and Russia as it is getting pressured by the Mujahideen. And eventually what's going to happen is that the DRA reaches out, again, they continue to keep reaching out to the Soviets, and eventually the Soviet Union decides they need to invade Afghanistan in order to crush the Mujahideen. And this obviously gets even more U.S. involvement in this. Again, the U.S. through the CAA is going to also start to give even more money and weapons. You can see here, this is this Afghan Mujahideen who's handling a U.S. Stinger anti-aircraft missile. These become really, really famous in Afghanistan because they bring down planes and helicopters. The United States and the CIA are just throwing money at the Mujahideen and ammo and other supplies to make sure that the Russian invasion here fails, right? It's not just the DRA anymore. It's actually, like, again, against Russian troops. Now, some of these factions of the Mujahideen, and this is what I want to kind of turn to, happen to be quite religiously extreme, okay? We would call them like extreme versions of like religious extremists, like a version of a version of Islam that doesn't fall by any means close to the mainstream. However, the CIA is willing to overlook that. Okay, for them, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So, for example, the United States goes to Egypt and they pressure Egypt to, who had recently arrested some of these different Islamist, extremist groups. So, for example, one of these guys is Ayman al-Zawahiri, okay, who will go on to become the second in command of Al-Qaeda, which we'll talk about here in a second. They also, the United States will just pay money to not even necessarily Mujahideen, but to any foreign fighters in the Arab world who want to go from where they are. Yemen and Saudi Arabia tend to be two of the highest areas, and go and fight in Afghanistan. One of these guys is Osama bin Laden, okay, who will take individuals from Saudi Arabia and they will go and fight in Afghanistan. So yes, at one time the U.S. was really paying people like Osama bin Laden to resist the Soviets. Just a weird world that we live in, right? So, how successful were the Soviets in Afghanistan? Well, I'm going to leave this YouTube video here for you to watch, and you can check that out. Okay. But I will tell you it does not go well. Okay. And the Soviets are eventually going to have to withdraw. Now, this happens for a whole host of reasons. You can watch there in the video why that is. Part of it is that they simply just can't get control of Afghanistan. They're also taking crazy amounts of casualties. And overseas, it also doesn't look good from a PR standpoint. Okay, and so Russia will actually withdraw out of Afghanistan in 1987. Now, when that happens, okay, a couple of very important, significant developments happen. One is that Afghanistan basically descends into a civil war for about the next 10 years. And different mujahideen groups are going to struggle and fight for control. Now, one of these groups, which is called the Taliban, which is born out of one of these mujahideen camps that is on like the border of Pakistan, is going to win out. Okay, and the Taliban are significant because, well, especially for the United States, is that they are going to be the ones who, once they have control of Afghanistan in the mid to late 1990s, they are going to be the ones who give safe harbor to Osama bin Laden to develop Al-Qaeda there as a terrorist group. Okay, and so they will give him safe harbor until 2001, until the United States invades Afghanistan and takes back control. Now, if you haven't been paying attention recently to world events, the U.S., starting in the Trump administration, but then kind of finally concluding in the Biden administration, withdrew fully from Afghanistan, and it has completely ceded back to Taliban control at this time. Okay, much at the detriment of the fleeting growth and gains that had happened in civil and women's rights in particular. Okay, so. Thinking about the long-term consequences of U.S. intervention in Afghanistan. A lot to ponder there. So go ahead and summarize that before you go. And once you do that, then you're all done. Okay, and I'll see you in the next lesson. All right, bye.